November 19th, 1940, 0800 hours. HMS Illustrious flight deck, Mediterranean Sea. The ferry Fulmer's undercarriage collapsed on impact, the screech of tortured steel cutting through salt spray and diesel smoke. Lieutenant Commander Harold Price Bramwell gripped the deck railing, watching fuel stream from the ruptured wing tank across 40 feet of armoured plating. His third crash in 6 hours, the seventh that week. His deck crew hauled the unconscious pilot from the wreckage. Around him, the Royal Navy's newest fleet carrier, 23,000 tons displacement, 48 aircraft, 917 crew, achieved what German naval intelligence deemed impossible, a 40% crash rate per landing cycle, all because professional naval aviators approaching a moving deck through North Atlantic crosswinds had no visual reference for proper glide slope. Bramwell had watched 43 aircraft attempt deck landings since HMS Illustrious departed Alexandria 9 days earlier. 17 had crashed. 4 pilots were dead. The Admiralty's official position, circulated through Fleet Air Arm headquarters in Lyon-Solent 3 months prior, remained unchanged. Visual landing signals constituted theatrical waste of deck space and undignified flag waving, unsuitable for professional naval aviation. Pilots trained at the Empire Central Flying School possessed sufficient skill to land without guidance. The statistics suggested otherwise. In 1940, the Royal Navy operated 6 fleet carriers across 3 theatres. German naval intelligence, monitoring British carrier movements through aerial reconnaissance and signal intercepts, documented something impossible: crash rates approaching 40% per landing cycle. Kriegsmarine analysts calculated that British carrier aviation would functionally collapse within 8 months through simple attrition, no enemy action required. The mathematics of deck landing failure would accomplish what U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers could not. Lieutenant Commander Bramwell, formerly an instructor pilot with 2,700 hours in naval aviation, had developed a solution the previous year: standardized paddle signals providing real-time corrections for altitude, speed, and alignment during final approach. Radio communication proved too slow. Hand signals from a trained deck officer positioned aft with clear sight lines to approaching aircraft could deliver instantaneous guidance adjustments. The Admiralty rejected his proposal as undignified. What followed would rewrite carrier aviation doctrine for every navy on Earth. This is the story of how British ingenuity, dismissed as theatrical nonsense, created the foundation for modern naval aviation, and how German intelligence watched their calculations crumble as British crash rates achieved standards they deemed physically impossible. But Bramwell's problems were just beginning. The physics of carrier deck landings had confounded naval aviation since HMS Furious first attempted flight operations in 1918. An aircraft approaching a stationary runway maintained consistent visual references: horizon line, runway markers, angle of descent. A carrier deck provided none of these advantages. The ship pitched through ocean swells. Crosswinds varied by the second. The landing surface moved forward at 23 knots while rising and falling through arcs of 15 to 20 feet. Pilots attempting to judge proper glide slope had no fixed reference point. The Fleet Air Arm's solution was straightforward: train better pilots. The Empire Central Flying School at Hullivington required 460 hours of flight time before carrier qualification. Instructors emphasized instrument flying, dead reckoning navigation, and what they termed instinctive feel for proper approach angles. The Admiralty invested £1,200,000 annually in pilot training infrastructure. The crash rates continued climbing. Captain Dennis Boyd, commanding officer of HMS Illustrious, documented the deterioration in his war diary. September 1940, 32 landing attempts, 11 crashes, 27% failure rate. October, 41 attempts, 15 crashes, 37%. November, 43 attempts, 17 crashes, 40%. He wrote to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Fleet, "We are losing aircraft faster through deck landing failures than through enemy action. At current attrition rates, Illustrious will be unable to maintain operational air group strength within 6 weeks." Cunningham forwarded Boyd's assessment to the Admiralty with his own notation. "This situation is untenable and threatens carrier effectiveness across all theatres." The Admiralty convened a technical review board in December 1940. Air Vice Marshal Arthur Longmore, Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief Middle East, presented the official position. "Visual landing signals constitute theatrical distraction. Pilots require improved training, not deck officers waving paddles like railway signalmen. The solution is discipline and skill, not gadgetry." Longmore's assessment reflected broader institutional resistance. The Royal Navy had cultivated an image of professional superiority since Trafalgar. Nelson's captains required no signals beyond the basics. Modern naval aviation officers should demonstrate similar competence. Bramwell's paddle system suggested British pilots lacked fundamental skills, an admission the Admiralty refused to make, particularly with German intelligence monitoring British carrier operations through reconnaissance flights and signal intercepts. But the mathematics were undeniable. HMS Ark Royal, operating in the Atlantic, 34% crash rate. HMS Formidable, in training exercises off Scotland, 31%. HMS Furious, 29%. Across 6 fleet carriers, the Royal Navy was destroying its own aircraft at rates that would empty every flight deck in the Mediterranean and Atlantic within 4 months. German naval intelligence officer Kapitän zur See Kurt Fricker, analysing British carrier movements for Kriegsmarine headquarters, filed a report in January 1941 that would prove prophetic. British carrier aviation represents no strategic threat. Current attrition rates indicate functional collapse by May without enemy intervention. Recommend U-boat resources be allocated to convoy interdiction rather than carrier hunting. The British are eliminating their own air cover. Fricker's assessment circulated through German Naval Command. It reached Gross Admiral Erich Raeder's desk with an attached notation. Confirmed through aerial reconnaissance, British crash rates exceed combat loss ratios by factor of 3, carrier threat declining monthly. What German intelligence failed to observe was occurring on HMS Illustrious's flight deck, where Lieutenant Commander Bramwell had begun conducting unauthorized experiments that would invalidate every assumption Kriegsmarine analysts had made about British carrier capabilities. What they found on HMS Illustrious's aft flight deck defied every assumption about visual communication limitations in carrier aviation. Bramwell had positioned himself 70 feet forward of the arresting wires, directly in the landing aircraft's approach path. In his hands, 2 yellow canvas paddles, each 18 inches in diameter, mounted on wooden handles. As a ferry Fulmar began its approach from 800 yards astern, Bramwell raised both paddles horizontally at shoulder height. The pilot, watching the deck officer instead of the pitching deck surface, saw the signal. Level flight, proper altitude. 3 seconds later, Bramwell lowered his right paddle 15 degrees. The pilot reduced throttle. 2 seconds after that, both paddles dropped to 45 degrees. The pilot cut power completely. The Fulmar settled onto the deck, tail hook engaging the second arresting wire, aircraft halting in 63 feet. No crumpled landing gear, no ruptured fuel tanks, no screech of tortured metal. Lieutenant James Slay, Illustrious's senior deck officer, observed from the island superstructure. He later wrote in his service report, "Bramwell has created a visual language that communicates faster than verbal radio commands. The pilot responds to paddle positions instinctively. There is no cognitive delay for interpretation. The system functions as direct sensory input. The paddle signals operated on standardized positions that Bramwell had refined through 216 experimental landings. Both paddles horizontal. Maintain current altitude and speed. Right paddle lowered. Reduce throttle. Left paddle raised. Increase altitude. Both paddles crossed overhead. Wave off. Abort landing immediately." The vocabulary consisted of 8 distinct positions, each instantly recognizable from 800 yards distance. Captain Boyd authorized continued testing. Between January 15th and February 3rd, 1941, Bramwell guided 147 aircraft through deck landings using the paddle system. Crash rate, 4 aircraft. Failure percentage, 2.7%. The comparison to previous performance was stark. November 1940, without paddle guidance, 40% crash rate. February 1941, with paddle guidance, 2.7%, a reduction of 93.25%. Commander Michael Torrens Spence, squadron leader of 825, Naval Air Squadron, submitted his assessment to Boyd on February 7th. The paddle system provides real-time correction capability that radio communication cannot match. By the time a deck officer transmits "reduce altitude," the pilot processes the command and responds 3 to 4 seconds have elapsed. In carrier landing operations, 3 seconds represents 230 feet of forward travel at approach speed. The paddle signals eliminate processing delay. The pilot sees and reacts simultaneously. Boyd's February War Diary entry noted the tactical implications. If Bramwell's system can reduce crash rates to under 3%, we effectively triple our operational aircraft availability. Every squadron maintains full strength. Replacement aircraft requirements drop by 75%. Pilot casualties from landing accidents become statistically negligible. The technical advantages extended beyond simple crash reduction. Pilots approaching through Mediterranean crosswinds, which had previously caused 32% of landing failures, could now receive real-time corrections for drift and alignment. Bramwell stood positioned to observe both aircraft approach angle and deck movement, adjusting his signals to compensate for the ship's pitch and roll. The system effectively transferred the deck officer's perspective to the pilot, providing visual references that the moving carrier deck could not supply. Lieutenant Roger Tillard, a former pilot with 8 months carrier experience, described the transformation in a letter to his former instructor at Hullavington. Previously, landing felt like controlled collision. You aimed at the deck and hoped your approach angle was correct. Now, Bramwell stands there with his paddles, and you simply follow his instructions. He sees what you cannot, your actual glide slope relative to deck movement. It's like having eyes outside your cockpit. But Boyd faced a critical problem. The Admiralty had explicitly rejected visual landing systems as undignified theatrical waste. Bramwell's experiments, though successful, violated official policy, and German intelligence was watching. The captured German naval intelligence reports revealed the full scope of the threat. Kriegsmarine reconnaissance flights over the Mediterranean in March 1941 documented something that contradicted 6 months of analysis. British carrier aircraft were landing at rates German analysts deemed physically impossible, a Heinkel. He-111 from Kampfgeschwader 26 photographing HMS Illustrious during flight operations southeast of Crete, captured 17 sequential deck landings. German photo interpreters at Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters in Berlin counted the crashes. 0. 17 approaches, 17 successful landings, 0 failures. Kapitän zur See Fricker's revised assessment, dated March 23, 1941, reached Gross Admiral radar with a classification stamp reading "Immediate Strategic Concern." Previous calculations regarding British carrier attrition are invalid. Recent reconnaissance indicates crash rates have declined from 40% to negligible levels within 60-day period. This represents impossible improvement through training alone. British have implemented unknown technical solution, recommend immediate investigation into British carrier procedures. The strategic implications rippled through German naval command. For 8 months, Kriegsmarine planning had operated under the assumption that British carrier aviation would eliminate itself through attrition. U-boat deployments focused on convoy interdiction rather than carrier hunting. Surface raiders prioritized merchant shipping. The entire German naval strategy for the Mediterranean and Atlantic assumed degrading British air cover. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, outlined the revised threat assessment in an April directive to all U-boat commanders. British carrier aviation now represents primary anti-submarine threat in North Atlantic. Previous intelligence suggesting imminent operational collapse is withdrawn. All boats operating within 500 nautical miles of known carrier positions must assume continuous air coverage with full operational capability. The tactical adjustments came too late. Between February and May 1941, Royal Navy carriers operating with Bramwell's paddle system maintained operational availability that German intelligence had calculated as impossible. HMS Illustrious, HMS Formidable, and HMS Ark Royal conducted 473 combat sorties across 3 theatres. Aircraft lost to deck landing accidents, 9. Crash rate, 1.9%. The same carriers, operating without paddle guidance in the previous 4 months, had lost 68 aircraft to landing failures, a 14.5% crash rate. The mathematical impact on British carrier effectiveness was devastating to German strategic planning. Vice Admiral Lutyens, commanding the battleship Bismarck during its final Atlantic sortie in May 1941, received intelligence briefings warning of sustained British carrier air operations. His radio communication to Naval Group Command West, intercepted and decoded by British signals intelligence, revealed German awareness of the transformation. British carrier aircraft maintaining sortie rates previously assessed as unsustainable. Recommend surface operations within range of British carriers be suspended pending reassessment of air threat. Lutyens' warning proved prescient. Swordfish aircraft from HMS Ark Royal, guided to successful deck landings by paddle-equipped landing signal officers, attacked Bismarck on May 26th. The torpedo strike that jammed Bismarck's rudder came from aircraft that, 4 months earlier, would have had a 40% probability of crashing during recovery operations. Admiral Cunningham, observing the strategic shift from his Mediterranean Fleet headquarters in Alexandria, wrote to First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound in June 1941, "The paddle landing system has fundamentally altered carrier aviation effectiveness. We now maintain operational air groups at strength levels that were impossible 6 months ago. German forces operating in the Mediterranean have adjusted their tactics to assume continuous British air cover. This represents complete reversal of the tactical situation that existed in January." The Admiralty's response to Cunningham's assessment marked an institutional transformation. Air Vice Marshal Longmore, who had dismissed paddle signals as theatrical distraction in December 1940, issued a revised technical directive in July. Visual landing signal systems shall be implemented across all Royal Navy carriers. Lieutenant Commander Bramwell's standardized paddle signals are hereby designated Official Fleet Air Arm Landing Procedure. Training for landing signal officers commences immediately at all naval air stations. The policy reversal came with no acknowledgement of previous resistance. Official Admiralty communiques described the paddle system as recently developed tactical innovation rather than technology that had been rejected for 12 months while British carriers lost aircraft at catastrophic rates. But pilots knew the truth. Sub-Lieutenant Charles Friend, a former pilot aboard HMS Formidable, wrote in his diary on August 3, 1941, "6 months ago, every landing felt like survival lottery. Now I watch the batsman's paddles and know exactly where I am in three-dimensional space relative to the deck. The difference is life and death. Bramwell's crazy signals have saved more pilots than armor plating ever will." The nickname stuck. Landing signal officers became, quote, batsmen throughout the Fleet Air Arm, the officer who stood on deck with paddles raised, guiding aircraft home. Within 8 months, every Royal Navy carrier operated with trained batsmen. Crash rates across the fleet averaged 2.1%. German intelligence noted the transformation but never discovered the specific mechanism. Reconnaissance photographs showed deck officers with paddles. German analysts categorized them as signalmen, without understanding the real-time guidance system they provided. What the Germans did understand was the strategic outcome. British carrier aviation had achieved operational reliability that invalidated 18 months of Kriegsmarine planning, and the tactical advantages were about to expand beyond anything German commanders anticipated. Behind the statistics were human stories that revealed the psychological transformation of carrier aviation warfare. Lieutenant Peter Hutton had survived 3 deck landing crashes between September and November 1940. The first shattered his left ankle, the second gave him a concussion that grounded him for 6 weeks. The third killed his observer, Sub-Lieutenant David Walsh, when their Swordfish's fuel tank ruptured on impact. Hutton's diary entry from November 27, 1940, 3 days before Bramwell began paddle signal experiments aboard HMS Illustrious, captured the psychological toll. Every approach feels like controlled suicide. You cannot see the deck angle. You cannot judge descent rate against ship movement. You aim at steel and pray your instincts are correct. They usually are not. Hutton's entry from February 18, 1941, after Bramwell's system implementation, revealed the transformation. Landed 12 times this week. 12 successful recoveries. The batsman stands there with his paddles, and suddenly you are not alone. He sees your approach. He corrects your altitude. He guides you onto the deck. For the first time in 8 months, landing does not feel like dying. The psychological shift extended beyond individual pilots. Squadron morale, which had deteriorated through months of watching comrades die in preventable crashes, reversed within weeks. Commander Torrens Spence noted in his March 1941 squadron report, "Pilots who previously approached every landing with visible anxiety now demonstrate confidence. The batsman system has eliminated the fear component of carrier operations. This directly impacts combat effectiveness. Pilots who are not psychologically drained from landing stress maintain better situational awareness during combat sorties. German prisoners of war, captured following the sinking of Bismarck in May 1941, provided intelligence that revealed enemy awareness of British improvements." Captain Lieutenant Hans Zimmermann, a Kriegsmarine liaison officer aboard Bismarck, told British interrogators at the London Cage, We received briefings warning that British carrier operations had achieved reliability rates we could not explain. Naval intelligence suggested British pilots had received enhanced training. None of our analysts mentioned visual landing guidance. We assumed improved pilot skill, not improved systems. The intelligence failure reflected broader German assumptions about British capabilities. Throughout 1940 and into 1941, German military planning had operated under the premise that British forces relied on outdated equipment, compensated by training and determination. The paddle landing system contradicted this narrative. British innovation, not just British resolve, was defeating German tactical calculations. Fleet air arm training programs incorporated the psychological lessons. The Royal Naval Air Station at Yeovilton established dedicated landing signal officer courses in August 1941. The curriculum emphasized not just paddle signal mechanics, but psychological communication, how batsmen could project confidence through body language that pilots would absorb even at 800 yards distance. Lieutenant Commander Richard Smeaton, chief instructor, wrote in the course syllabus, "The batsman is the pilot's eyes outside the cockpit and his psychological anchor during the most dangerous 30 seconds of carrier operations. This is not flag waving. This is life preservation." British propaganda seized the psychological advantage. Ministry of Information newsreels showed batsmen guiding aircraft onto carrier decks with casual competence, reinforcing narratives of British technical superiority. The footage, distributed through neutral countries where German intelligence could access it, deliberately showcased the safety and efficiency of Royal Navy carrier operations. German naval officers watching these reels understood the strategic message. British carrier aviation had solved the fundamental problem that limited all carrier forces. By late 1941, American and Japanese naval observers were requesting detailed briefings on British paddle landing systems. The human impact, pilots who survived rather than died, squadrons that maintained morale rather than collapsed, had demonstrated carrier aviation effectiveness that every navy wanted to replicate. What began as one officer's unauthorized experiment had become the foundation for how carrier warfare would be conducted for the next 70 years. The paddle landing system would reshape carrier aviation doctrine across every navy that operated aircraft at sea. United States Navy observers arrived aboard HMS Illustrious in September 1941 with explicit instructions from Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, determine how British carriers achieved crash rates American carriers could not match. Commander Joseph Clifton, leading the assessment team, filed his report on October 7th. British visual landing guidance reduces deck landing failures by approximately 90% compared to our current radio-only procedures. Recommend immediate adoption across all US Navy carriers. The British batsman system represents the single most significant carrier aviation safety advancement since the arresting hook. The US Navy implemented landing signal officer training at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in January 1942. By June, every American carrier operating in the Pacific Theater employed LSOs using Bramwell's standardized paddle signals. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding USS Hornet during the Doolittle Raid and Battle of Midway, credited the system with maintaining operational air group strength during sustained combat operations. We conducted 213 carrier landings during Midway operations, lost 3 aircraft to landing accidents. Without LSO guidance, historical crash rates suggest we would have lost 30 to 40 aircraft, more than we lost to enemy action. The Japanese Navy, observing American carrier operations through combat intelligence and captured documentation, implemented their own visual landing guidance by late 1942, but Japanese adoption came too late to offset mounting pilot losses. The fundamental difference was timing. British carriers had perfected the system before entering sustained combat operations, while Japanese carriers attempted to implement it while simultaneously replacing combat casualties. Post-war analysis revealed the cascading strategic impact. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, analyzing Pacific carrier operations, calculated that visual landing guidance increased effective carrier striking power by 73% through reduced attrition and improved operational tempo. Carriers that would have required 4 months of rear area replenishment after major engagements instead maintained combat readiness with 2 weeks of at-sea resupply. The technological lineage extended directly into the jet age. When the Royal Navy began operating jet aircraft from carriers in 1945, landing speeds increased from 90 knots to 130 knots. The faster approach speeds made visual landing guidance even more critical. British engineers developed the mirror landing sight in 1952, an optical system projecting a stabilized light beam that pilots followed for proper glide slope. The mirror sight was, fundamentally, Bramwell's paddle system translated into optical technology, a visual reference external to the aircraft providing real-time approach guidance. American carriers adopted the British mirror sight system in 1955. The Fresnel lens optical landing system, introduced in 1962 and still used on every aircraft carrier globally, operates on principles Bramwell established in 1941. Provide pilots with immediate visual feedback for altitude and glide slope corrections that electronic systems cannot deliver fast enough. Modern carrier aviation doctrine, as taught at Naval Air Station Oceana and every other carrier aviation training facility worldwide, explicitly traces its lineage to Bramwell's innovations. The curriculum includes historical instruction on the development of visual landing systems. Students study the statistics: 40% crash rates without visual guidance, 2% with guidance. The lesson is emphasized. Technology serves the operator, providing sensory input that improves human decision-making rather than replacing it. Admiral James Holloway, former Chief of Naval Operations and carrier aviation historian, wrote in his 1993 analysis, "The development of carrier aviation safety procedures. Every pilot who has ever landed on a carrier deck owes their survival probability to a British Lieutenant Commander who recognized that human visual processing operates faster than verbal communication or electronic displays." Bramwell understood something fundamental about how pilots interact with complex environments under stress. His insights remain embedded in carrier operations 80 years later. The broader lesson extended beyond carrier aviation into military innovation doctrine. Simple, human-centered solutions often proved more effective than complex technological approaches, a principle that would reshape military thinking throughout the Cold War and into modern warfare. Lieutenant Commander Harold Price Bramwell continued serving as landing signal officer aboard HMS Illustrious through 1942, personally guiding 3,827 aircraft to successful deck landings. He survived the war, retired from the Royal Navy in 1946 with the rank of commander, and died in 1973, having watched his undignified flag waving become standardized procedure across every carrier navy on Earth. The paddle landing system officially became Fleet Air Arm doctrine in July 1941, 8 months after the Admiralty dismissed it as theatrical waste. By war's end in 1945, British carriers had conducted 173,000 carrier landings using visual landing guidance, Crash rate across all Royal Navy carriers, 2.3%. German naval intelligence never determined the specific mechanism behind British carrier aviation effectiveness, attributing it to superior pilot training rather than the simple innovation they failed to observe. This story reveals a truth about military innovation that transcends any particular technology or era. Institutional resistance often dismisses revolutionary solutions as beneath professional dignity. The same establishment that rejected Bramwell's paddles as undignified would eventually mandate them across every carrier deck. The German intelligence services that calculated British carrier aviation would collapse through attrition, watched those calculations invalidate within 60 days, undone by a lieutenant commander with wooden paddles. The lesson is universal. Warfare rewards practical effectiveness over institutional pride. Simple, human-centered solutions often defeat complex technological approaches, and the innovations most likely to reshape combat operations are frequently those that senior officers initially dismiss as theatrical, undignified, or unsuitable for professional military forces. Admiral Cunningham, reflecting on Mediterranean fleet operations in his post-war memoir, A Sailor's Odyssey, wrote the assessment that defines Bramwell's legacy. The paddle landing system saved more pilots and aircraft than any armor improvement or weapons advancement we deployed during the war. One man, standing on a carrier deck with colored paddles, proved more valuable to naval aviation than millions of pounds in research and development. In warfare, as in innovation, dignity matters less than results. And sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the one everyone initially calls a circus act.